This collection is American comics, and it's the ones aimed at the younger end of the spectrum. Like, I was lucky enough to read the comics that got burned in the 50s because my father would bring them home as cheaper to buy used comics, 2 for a dime, than let me go out and waste my money on a 10-cent Superman. And that meant that I was discovering things like The Vault of Horror and Tales from the Crypt, and of course the early Mad comics that completely shaped and misshaped me and a generation. But the comics that this is about are the ones that weren't worthy of being banned and burned, but the ones that actually can hold their own with the great mid-century children's literature of the time, but nobody recognized it back in the day.
Because they were being made to be read and thrown out.
And also, all comics were looked at suspiciously, even the ones that were benign, so that even those clever and really brilliant in some cases, Little Lulu stories by John Stanley, the Carl Barks, Donald Duck stories, these were great things, but they were seen as, like you say, disposable, but also just mixing words and pictures together that way and writing them all in caps was already like moving you toward illiteracy. And as a result, all comics were looked at best, an annoyance.
Since they were disposable, how many of these things survive? When you were thinking about including the best, or at least what was available as the best, how'd you even get these things?
Well, it's one of the technological change of the recent few years that has made this book possible, is that now there are a lot of low-res scans on the internet that allow you at least to know what exists and to inventory it and to read it. So we spent a year or two just Art downloaded endless amount of scans reading kids' comics, and then when it came time to try to find the original for the book, then we were able, again, through emails and putting out bulletin boards and talking to advisors and collectors.
Because I'm sure that some of the copyrights here are kind of fuzzy. If you try to put
that's
together
a whole other issue, yeah.
That's why the book was
put
hell.
together something of old records. It's often unclear who owns the rights these days.
Yeah, that was a dizzying part of putting the book together.
But with music and movies, people already know that there is worth, value in it. With comics, it hasn't quite yet been worth anybody's while. So a lot of it was detective work and trying to trace. And it actually gave an insight into the creative process at the time, because we had to figure out what company it was produced at. And there is a difference which became clear as we read more and more comics between the animators on the West Coast and the cartoonists on the East Coast that were doing derived material, licensed material in comics. So it actually was part of the research process, is to try to understand who had produced what. There were house styles to some extent.
Different comic book companies produce different kind of comic books. Obviously, they would have 1 or 2 writers, but they would also have a target market, I'd imagine.
Well, comics really is like a lemming-like fad business. So what happened in the 40s was everybody was doing flying superheroes till the end of World War II, and then they all did gangster comics. But this kind of less focused on part of comics that this the classic children's comics Treasury focused on was what most companies had at least a few of, which were comics targeted is the word you used, although I hate that word, but because it sort of implies killing the consumer, targeting them. But in those comics...
Aimed at.
Ooh,
that's just as bad.
I don't know. But the comics that were designed to be read by younger readers was part of most comic book companies. So even EC Comics that did the more overwhelmingly pernicious and wonderful horror and crime comics, they had early on a kind of line called Tiny Tot Comics from the same publishing house that was aimed at kids. It was just pretty terribly done.
Well, we should point out that a lot of these, the ones that you have here, are kind of clever and witty.
Oh, that's what we look for.
It's like watching Sesame Street with your kid. You realize that there are little pleasures there for grown-ups as well.
Well, that's one of the most heartening realization of the past decade for Art and I, which is that we went into doing comics for kids out of a missionary zeal, because we felt that the future would only exist if we did something for the children to love what we love, which is books and comics.
It does get kids reading as well.
Exactly.
And to help you learn English.
Exactly. And we discovered that instead of being a limitation because you are targeting and aiming at an audience and you don't have the freedom, the artistic freedoms that you would have if you were working for an adult audience, you actually end up with something that's a cleaner, pure, stricter version of comics.